I've been flying FPV for about 7 months now, and I'm addicted. As humans who are stuck on the ground, getting an aerial perspective on things is something that many people don't get to see. Of course, you have the regular consumer DJI drones, and those are cool. But there's something exhilarating about being in full control of a drone, diving a mountain, and doing flips and rolls. It's a new way of looking at life. In the world of FPV drones, there are a lot of different styles. Some are insane freestyle pilots, some are hardcore bando bashers, and some are racers. But I mainly got into FPV because of these insane cinematic shots that I've seen on Instagram and YouTube, and these are shots that you can't really recreate with a regular DJI drone. There's a ton of information out there about FPV, but I think the overwhelming part is knowing where to start. Today, I'm going to break it down for you. Before we get started, here's a quick rundown. You have three main components of FPV: your drone, goggles, and radio. Your goggles that you see out of this small camera, which gives you a feed of what your drone sees with a very low latency so that you can do all these precise maneuvers. Your radio controls your quad, which is nothing like your typical Mavic drones. You have full control of the sticks, and you need to be controlling the drone at all times. There are no safety features on the drone, which makes it very hard to start and learn, which is why I first recommend a simulator. With the simulator, it gives you a risk-free way of practicing FPV because you can just restart if you crash, so you're not smashing your new drone right away. My favorite simulator is Liftoff, but there are a ton of other simulators out there, and when I first got started, I spent a bunch of time in the simulator just learning how to keep my quad steady, how to slowly maneuver them through gates, and fly where I wanted to fly. These simulators are pretty cheap, but you will need to invest in a controller to get started with them. I've had people ask me if you can get started with an Xbox or PlayStation controller, and you could, but it's definitely not ideal. If you look at this controller, when I move the left joystick, it doesn't bounce back. Compared to this Xbox controller, when I move the joystick, it bounces back to the middle. And even though this change is very subtle, it definitely makes a big difference. So I highly recommend starting with an actual FPV controller. This controller has a control link called Express LRS, which is a new innovative link, and if you're just starting out, I definitely would recommend going with Express LRS. Another great control link is called TBS Crossfire, which is a little bit older but it's a very matured system, and it still stacks up great with Express LRS. So if you're just starting out, I definitely would recommend getting one of these two. Once you buy a controller, you're all set up to plug it into your computer and start practicing in the simulator. Just be aware that you are going to suck and it will be a little bit frustrating. It took me so many hours in the simulator to even get the hang of flying through some race gates, so it's important to be practicing a little bit every day and not give up. Once you get a hang of the simulator, it's time to pick up your first drone and the rest of the things that you need to fly it. I'm going to be focusing on the standard FPV drones instead of the ones made by DJI. My problem with those drones is that you're using DJI's technology, which makes it very hard to repair, so if you crash it, you're going to have to send it into DJI, which can get very expensive. Now, standard FPV drones are going to be a bit more of a hassle to get up into the air. Most flight controllers use a software called Betaflight to be able to program it. This is where you do things like change your on-screen display options, tune your quad, and change your rates, which is basically like the sensitivity of your sticks. When trying to fly cinematically, you'll definitely want to be flying with those slower rates to get those smooth lines. You won't have safety features like GPS built in, even though you can install that yourself, or the ability to let your drone just hover by itself, but I think these features actually build bad habits because you don't want to be relying on them when you're flying a quad that doesn't have these features. Now onto the drones. With FPV drones, you have two options, analog or digital. Analog gives you that VHS look in your goggles, which is a little bit cheaper but somewhat old school. Or you have the choice of going digital, which is a little more expensive but the feed that you see is a lot more clear. With these goggles, I'm running the DJI FPV system, but regardless of which way you go, you'll want to strap an external camera to the top of your quad anyways. I'm using a GoPro 11 and I would highly recommend getting a GoPro. I've just found that they give you the best image quality out of an action camera, and lets you run the footage through a program called RealSteady to stabilize your footage, which is honestly like magic. When looking for your first drone, people usually recommend going with a 5-inch, 3-inch, or a tiny whoop. The 5-inch and 3-inch refers to the diameter of the propellers. I personally would recommend going with a 5-inch as your first quad. It has lots of power, it's very nimble, and has great flight characteristics. 5-inch is a very standard size quad and is probably the most common size that people fly with. You can learn how to do flips and rolls with it. You can dive mountains with it, it's super fast when you want to just rip along the ground and go max speed, and it's really fun to fly. Most people will have the most fun with a 5-inch quad, and you'll have the most room to improve with it if you're looking to just get one right now. Another option would be a 3-inch Cinewhoop. A Cinewhoop is basically just a quad that has ducts around the props, letting you fly indoors or around people, and is great for flying through small gaps. The problem is because of these ducts, the drone is a little bit slower, it's a lot louder, and it doesn't like to do big movements like flips and rolls. I personally think that even if you want to eventually get a Cinewhoop to fly indoors around people, it's easier to start off with a 5-inch first so that you're not limited to the types of moves that you can perform while you're learning. People also recommend a Tiny Whoop, which is this tiny little drone. It's great for flying through super small gaps, and you can handle indoor and some light outdoor flying. The problem with this is that when you're just starting out, even though this drone is really small, flying indoors is a lot harder than it seems. When I first started out with one of these Tiny Whoops, I couldn't fly for more than 3 seconds without hitting something, which is very annoying to practice with because I spend more time picking up my drone than actually flying. Regardless of which drone you choose to get first, you now have 2 options. You can either build your own drone, or you can get what's known as a bind and fly, which means the drone comes pre-built for you. If you're someone who likes to tinker and solder, and you've always liked to do technical things like building your own PC, then I definitely would recommend building your own drone first. You get to choose all the parts that you want, and you know how to put everything together so that when you eventually do crash, you'll know exactly how to fix your quad. It can also be very rewarding knowing that something that you built with your own hands is up in the air and flying. Just know that you'll definitely be jumping into the deep end, but if you're that person, by all means, have fun with it. If you choose to go with a bind and fly, the company that you buy the quad from builds the drone for you and ships it to you, and it's usually tuned up and ready to go. All you have to do is bind your controller and goggles to it and you're ready to fly. You still will need to go into beta flight to configure some things like set up your own rates and configure what the switches do on your controller, but it saves a lot of time if you don't want to deal with building or tuning your own drone. And then when you eventually do crash and break something, then you can learn from there how to fix your drone. FPV is definitely not an easy hobby to get started with, but can be so rewarding once you spend the time to learn everything. And once you get through the initial barrier and get your quad up and flying, I guarantee you'll be addicted.